Hello, welcome back to All for United. If there was ever two people I wanted to do a show again, this is it right here. Obviously, Benny, I'm sure most of you will remember, long-standing contributor and host on All for United. Firstly, welcome back, Benny. It's been a while. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's been a long while, mate. And people that know me will know my health's not been the best, but slowly getting back on track. And it's good to be back, mate. I've been wanting to come back for absolutely ages. So hopefully the viewers will see me on more and more shows on both the men's and women's channels going forward now. So hopefully it'll be I'll be back for a good long haul again.
Definitely, you'll be seeing more of Benny, that's for sure, as the rest of the second half of the season progresses, and Tony as well. For people who don't know, obviously, well, I'm pretty sure everyone knows who you are if they're watching this show. But for people who don't know you or don't follow you, obviously, how would you, I guess, summarize your kind of expert knowledge? I'll summarize it on the academy side.
Yeah, I'm a season ticket holder. I've been following United since the early 70s, and always taken a very keen interest in the youth team. And as many people probably aware, myself and Steve Hoban wrote a definitive history on the youth team going back to the 1930s. So and that book's now sold out. So unfortunately, there's no more left. We've only got digital copies left now. But I've been following the youth team since. Oh, there you go, Benny. there is a hard copy still out there. So I've been following all the youth teams, really, Connor, for the last 40-odd years, really.
I was just about to ask you if that book's sold out, but yeah, you answered it for me. Yes, it is. So, Benny, you've got that treasure trove of a book right there that you can have a sift through, and have to let me have a read at some point as well, because I've not read through it all yet. We'll start with Garnacho, because obviously we're going to get into the 18s, the 21s, obviously talk about some other players as well and who to be excited for, I guess, for 2023 and onwards. But Garnacho is the one, obviously, that's pushed his way into the first team, obviously, this season. Not only that, he's contributing, obviously, on a regular basis. Obviously, got the second goal against Leeds. What have you made of his kind of rise into the first team? Because it's a player we've spoken about for a while on this channel. I think you mentioned him on one of your first shows, but are you a little bit surprised that he's gone into the team this early and been a constant kind of rotation player in there and starting games as well? Or is this the kind of expectation that you thought you had for him with seeing him in the academy side?
It's a good question. Garnacho, let me go back. In 2021, he was integrating into the academy. And then in the second half of the season, he kind of surprised a lot of people because he was quite slight. So people like Gerardo and McNeil and Hugel and a few others, they all came at the same time. He wasn't really getting a lot of games. He was in the under-16s because he was so small. I'm suggesting that. I don't know for a fact, but that's my understanding. And then all of a sudden, he scored a couple of goals at Wigan in the Premier League Cup. Very good goals. And it seemed to give him a little bit of impetus. And then towards the end of the season, he broke through into the under-18s on a more regular basis. And then last season, he had a fabulous year. And I think I've mentioned to both of you before, the FA Youth Cup is a really interesting tournament. And if you can get a decent run and build some momentum, which is what we did last year, you see the confidence in players, happening before your eyes. And what we saw last year with winning the FA Youth Cup is that all of those players were able to showcase. And all the games were Premier League stadiums or First Division stadiums. So they played, Leicester City, they played Wolves, they played Everton, they played Reading down at Reading's ground. And then as they got obviously to the final with a huge crowd, you could see those players, Mainu and all of them, just really coming into their own. In a number of different ways. But I think that competition brought Garnacho's, I don't know how the right words to use, I suppose, but it's more than just competence and confidence. I think it was momentum. And I'm a firm believer that you get a chance based on many factors. Some of it is luck. Some of it is, you're forcing your way in. But sometimes it's just momentum. and you get carried along with stuff. And I think what happened to Garnacho, particularly last season, was that we had Marcus Rashford struggling, as many people remember. He was out of form and injured. We had a number of other, Sancho out of form as well. So there was an opportunity for him to push his way in and build on that momentum. And we saw that towards the end of the season, and the end of the season when Rangnick gave him his chance. And I think it was a natural progression. I don't think with Garnacho he's made what I would call huge jumps or strides. It's been this real steady evolution. And I've been watching him pretty closely as he's been in the first team. He's not played a lot of reserve football at all. He's been on the fringes of the first team virtually all the season. And every time I see him play, I can almost see the coaching that Ten Hag and the team are doing. He's getting more disciplined with his defending. His decision-making is getting better. He's not losing his eye for goal or anything else. Yeah, he's going to have some ups and downs. He's going to miss goals and all the rest of it. Of course, he's 18 years old. I mean, they all do. But what I've seen in him is a growing maturity as that momentum is continuing to go. And what happens with a lot of youth players is they plateau. And again, we've had this conversation before about, Charlie McNeil is a really good example. He had a cracking under-18 season, scored a shed load of goals, and then the minute he got into the under-21s, he couldn't progress. He plateaued. And there were some reasons for that. Physically, there were some reasons for that. With Alejandro, I don't think he's had that problem. I think he's just steadily making progress. I noticed someone's just said he needs to put weight on. Well, yeah, he's an 18-year-old kid. He hasn't got the physique of other lads. That'll come with time. And sometimes you can put too much bulk on too quickly. We've seen that a lot with a few players as well. So he will be just building and building and building. And in addition to his physicality and his ability to, take on board tactical instructions and continue to have an eye for goal, I think the other thing that is really interesting for me is his emotional resilience. So we got a little bit of caning, as many of you might have seen on the internet, particularly on Twitter, by a whole bunch of clowns who I'm not even going to go into. And you think to yourself, he's an 18-year-old kid. And what did he do? He bounced straight back with a really good substitute performance against Leeds in a very hostile environment. And I'm just thinking, just let him evolve. He will evolve into a very good player. And I think we don't need to do anything. We just need to let that evolution happen naturally. He will continue to make mistakes, but on the other hand, he will continue to score goals, contribute to goals, be an integral part of the first team. He'll put on weight. They'll swap him in position. He'll play on the right wing as well as the left wing. All of those things will happen. Who knows where he is now might not even be his eventual position. We don't know. So I think he's really exciting. I think a lot of people, when they saw him in the Youth Cup, he was kind of the star player, really, particularly with the goals he was scoring. And it was easy to get behind him because, he contributed to our success last season. And I think, he's a good little player. There's still more to come. And it's just been a pleasure to watch him just grow in every game.
How much, Tony, on the coaching aspect of Garnacho, how much do you put it down to people like, obviously everyone's going to say Ten Hag, but I want about more of the coach stuff like your Mitchell van der Gaag's and your Steve McLaren's, especially Steve McLaren, who has been there. He's coached a lot of youth players over the years, especially at Manchester United as well, because he would have had a lot of the class of 92 under him. Obviously, I know when he was around, the class of 92 were very much in their pomp. But how much do you think that's helping Alejandro Garnacho? Having coaches that have been there, done it all, won things. And say Steve McLaren, he might not have been the greatest manager ever, to grace the game of football, but his coaching, I think, is absolutely, when Ten Hag brought him in, it's absolutely spot on. So I just wonder how much of an influence you think that these coaches have over Garnacho.
I think there's a number of elements to that. I think it depends how much coaching is needed for a start, and certain players don't need a lot of coaching. So, you look at someone like Ryan Giggs going and back. Ryan Giggs didn't need coaching, right? Just let him loose and he was fine. And I've seen lots and lots of players who didn't need coaching. And then other players need mentorship. And I think they're two different things, Benny. I think coaching and mentorship are two different things. And by the way, I don't know the answer to your question specifically because I don't have access to, who's actually talking to him off the pitch. Here's what I can surmise. And I have a view about consistency. So without a doubt, I think Benny McCarthy's involved. So he's helping all the strikers and all the forward players, with some tactical influence in terms of making runs, in terms of holding up the ball, in terms of getting in the right positions, all of that stuff. Maybe some finishing skills as well, but that's not massively an issue for Garnacho. Without a doubt, there's a lot of coaching experience in the club at the moment, and that only can be helpful. I think what a lot of young players need at that age is the mentorship. I mean, and maybe not even that age. You look at Marcus Rashford. I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree. He's been a revelation this season compared to last, and he's exactly the same player. He's not getting. I don't think he's getting coaching. I think he's getting mentored, and I think I said on previous programs, a lot of it is confidence. So what happens with young kids is they have lapses of confidence, and I think the likes of Steve McLaren, particularly with his experience, you mentioned him, but obviously others as well. I think they're probably really, really good at mentorship. And so they're managing that emotional journey as much as the physical and technical journey, Benny. And I think when you put that together, you get a really good recipe. In addition, I think for the first time, we've got a backroom team that's all talking the same language. So when Ten Hag says something to him on the side of the pitch, we've all seen that happen. McLaren's reinforcing exactly the same message. And all the other coaches are reinforcing because they're all in the same hymn sheet. And I think that is massive. And we haven't had that for a long time because we've had this kind of uncertainty with coaches, as you know, with, Carrick was in, then he was out. Giggs was in, then he was out. We've had so many people in and out without really knowing who's in and out. Fletcher's been in and out. Kieran McKenna's been in and out. There's been so many changes. And I think consistency, and I think it's really underrated for the young boys. So when someone like Garnacho goes, I mean, he was at Carrington on the weekend, I believe. He's gonna knock around with all the other kids who he played with last season. But then Travis Binion, the manager who's still there, he's going to be having a word. So again, it's reinforcing, and I think that reinforcing mentoring role is pretty critical with young players.
I think you mentioned, obviously, McCarthy's getting a lot of love on Twitter, especially the last few days. Obviously, what he's doing with the attackers in particular, obviously, that we're seeing. You mentioned Rashford. Before we look at individual play, we talk about a bit more about individual players and other things. Well, we were having a bit of a chat about this before we came on air, but because obviously Hannibal's on the thumbnail. Obviously, I mentioned, as everyone knows, we brought him in. Obviously, then went into the academy. Just for yourself, what counts as an academy graduate for you? If you could sum it up, what is an academy graduate? And maybe as a follow-up question to that, what is a successful academy graduate for you?
Got big questions. So I think the easiest thing to do is to look at history. And if you go back to the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, you weren't allowed to take a boy on the ground staff on signed terms until they were 15 or 16 years old. So that meant that the Georgie Bests and the Bobby Charlton and the Norman Whiteside and the Mark Hughes and the Ryan Giggs and the David Beckhams, and you can name the whole lot in the whole history of the club. And this isn't just Man United, by the way, this is every club. You only could be a graduate. You could only join the academy system. And it wasn't called an academy, it's called the youth system. You could only join the youth system when you were 15 or 16. And those kids came from all over the globe. They came from all over the world. They came from, all over the UK, and they came straight from school. So they would have been playing for their school teams. They would have been playing for a local boys team on a Saturday. Like Marcus Rashford came from Fletcher Moss Rangers. So all these kids would have been playing for them, playing for their school. And then when they reached 15, they would have signed associate schoolboy terms, which is the equivalent of under 15, under 16 academy. Then they would have signed associate professional terms at 16 and then pro terms at 17. So in terms of that, if you look at ages, nothing's changed. All that's changed is in 1999, you now had the Premier League and the FA agree that you could have an academy system that meant you're allowed to take boys as young as 6 and 7, put them in the system. Now, those boys can't sign professional contracts. They're too young. So they can, it's a bit more complex than this, but fundamentally they can come and go pretty much depending on their personal circumstances. The minute they sign a scholarship at 16, that's the equivalent of what they've done throughout eternity in youth systems. So if you want to be correct, what you have to do is you have to use the same criteria going back in time, so you haven't got different criteria determining different things. So therefore, the way I determine an academy graduate is anybody who's played in the academy, which is the equivalent of under 16s or under 18s. And if they've played in the academy, that means they would have played in academy matches against other academy teams. And if they've done that, it doesn't matter, like Marcus Rashford, who's been with the club since he was 7, or Alejandro Garnacho, who arrived at 16, or Hannibal Medri, who arrived at 17. I don't think it makes any difference. They all arrived with a basic criteria that said they weren't professional footballers. They hadn't played first team anywhere else. They were all amateurs. They were all under 17 years old, and they played in our academy. So it's really straightforward. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to get into a very, very unique situation that says the academy system started in 1999. So you take a 7-year-old kid in 1999. He's not therefore going to be in the first team until 2009. So therefore, if you're only ever saying that it's only kids who started when they were 7 years old, you're basically saying the youth system didn't start till 2009. Well, that's a ludicrous statement to make, given our history of youth development since 1932. That's just doesn't make any sense. So I think we've got to be careful when, you know, people on social media say, well, he's not really part of. Pogba's a good example. Oh, he wasn't really. Of course he bloody was. You know, he came at 16. He had 2 seasons with the under 18s. He had a season in the under 21s. He was with us for 4 years. So if he wasn't in the youth system, where was he playing? So for me, Connor, it's really simple. It's, did they play in the academy? Yes or no? Have they played for anyone else as a professional? Yes or no? And did they then reach the first team at Man United? Then, you know, there's someone who reached our first team from the academy system. What was your second question again? I forgot the second question.
I just added a follow up to that in terms of what you would deem as a successful.
That's a much harder question. That's a much harder question, because I think what fans define as successful is very different from what the club might define as successful, which is very different from what the player might define as successful, which is very different from what the family might define as successful. So let me just go through those 4 things. So from a fan perspective, there's this nonsense that you often hear on social media that, well, United haven't produced any world-class players since, you know, Scholes or Beckham or whatever. And I go, well, have a look in every other academy and see how many world-class players are being pumped out every single season. Spurs have had 1 in 10 years, Harry Kane. Arsenal have maybe got 1 in Saka. Who was the one before that? Do you know what I'm saying? People make it sound like this. Every club's got this like conveyor belt. No, they don't. You know, world-class players come every now and again. And so in terms of what the fans think is a success with the academy, I think can sometimes be tempered with unrealistic expectations. Now, there's another type of fan who understands that the academy is there to support the first team and that every player has a role to play, and that not every one of those players is going to be a superstar. So you can think of your John O'Shea's and your Phil Nevilles and all these sort of players, who, by the way, played like 100 games for their countries and won numerous medals. And, you know, so we're not talking about unsuccessful players. But you would never say John O'Shea was world class. I think most people would agree that's as a statement that John O'Shea was not a world class player. He was a bloody good player, and he was an international player, as was Darren Fletcher, and as was many others. You know, Wes Brown and etc. You don't always have to be a Ryan Giggs or a David Beckham or a Paul Scholes to become a very good player. Look at Marcus Rashford, 340 games, 115 goals. I mean, how many players can say they've scored 100 goals for their club? So you can't say that that's not successful. And if you said to Man United, you're going to buy a player for free, they're going to play 330, 340 games and score you 120 goals. Well, I would argue that virtually any Premier League club would snap your hands off at that. So I think from a fan's perspective, we define it very differently from a club. So when you go back to the club, how do they define it? They want to obviously have a whole bunch particularly at United. Not every club does this, but at United, we've always had a core of youth. And that's very important to our DNA, and that's very important for the history of the club, and that's very important as a mechanism to attract talent into the club for that pathway. So the Garnachos of the world, he had a choice to go to many, many clubs, including Real Madrid. And he wanted to come to United for a very specific reason. And that's what he was going to get first team football. He might not get that at Real Madrid if he went there. And Man City was the same. So that pathway that we create for the Scott McTominays, who's now on 200 games, and the Anthony Alangas, who's now on 50 games, I don't care whether fans rate those players or not. What those players contribute is what the club's looking for. And fans can be very, very temperamental in terms of up and down support, but I don't prescribe to the thing that says unless we're producing world-class players, it isn't working. Of course it's working. Garnacho's in the squad, McTominay's in the squad, Alanga's in the squad, Mainoo's in the squad, Iqbal's in the squad, Garnacho's in the squad, McTominay's in the squad, Rashford's in the squad. I can keep going. We have a very successful youth system as far as, what success looks like. Then you go to the player, and I think the player just wants a career. And that's where you go to the second half of your question on that area, Connor, which is we've supplied 100 non-Man United players who are playing professionally around the world, 100, more than any other club. And if you think about that, that's unbelievable. Totally unbelievable. If you look at that from a statistical perspective, that's unbelievable. Because if you look at it and say, okay, there's 92 clubs every weekend, and those 92 clubs could only have 18 players. That's just over 1,600 positions. Well, 1,600 positions, take half of that because all the foreigners are taking half the places. So that comes down now to 800 places. 100 of those are taken by Man United players. An eighth of every player playing in a match day squad is a Man United academy player. That's just an incredible statistic. And so I think from the player's perspective, whether you're, Galbraith at Salford or Dylan Levitt at Dundee United or, Arno Puigdemont over in Spain when he went home, all those players are just really happy to have a career in the game. They're playing professional football. So I think the players determine success differently. And then the fourth part of that is family. And I think a lot of the families just want to bring up sons. I mean, Benny, I know the women's academy's been incredibly successful too. So I'll add females into that loop, but I don't know that well enough to be the expert because I don't follow the women's academy like I do the men's. But I think the families just want their children to grow up as decent adults with a huge positive moral compass, with a set of standards that says this is the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do. And it was fascinating hearing who was the guy, the coach of Birmingham. I've forgotten his name. The manager of Birmingham.
Oh, you got me.
He said in the news the other day that Hannibal Mejri and Taith Chong, he said, you can tell they're Manchester United players because they have certain standards. And I think from a family perspective, that's what they want. They want their boys and their girls to, if they're going to leave the academy and go out into the world, that they have a set of morals and set of standards that's going to hold them, in really good stead. So I think you put, Connor, to answer your question kind of succinctly, I think it's about reaching the first team. I think it's about contributing to the first team. It's having a career in the game and being a fantastic human being. And I think we're really good at doing all those four things for the most part.
Tony, just a follow-up question to that as well. Do you think there's more pressure now on young kids and young players coming through the academy? Do you think there's more pressure on them now to succeed, to become first-team players, whether it be for Manchester United or whether it be for another professional side, wherever it may be across the globe? Because all you ever see is that sometimes a player may break through and then they'll have one bad game. For example, like Alejandro Garnacho, who didn't really have a bad game against Leeds at Old Trafford. Then people start griping and picking up negative points and start battering these players with them. Do you think there's a lot more pressure then on players now coming through the system than there was maybe a decade ago, say?
I wouldn't say, I don't think it's more than a decade. Well, I think there's two differences in terms of pressure. which is why I was talking about the mentorship and the emotional intelligence of a lot of players, Benny. I think I've got to be careful how I say this, but I think there's two things that's changed. What the academy system has done that didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago is it's put pressure on parents. So now all of a sudden your kid's going to be in an academy. Well, you go back to 1998, your kid wasn't in an academy. He wasn't even picked up until he was 15 or 16. So the kid, you as the parent weren't under any pressure. And more often than not, the kids never saw their parents on a Saturday anyway, because the parents were working or they had other commitments to make. You know, I remember standing down at Littleton Road and the Cliff. You never saw that many parents, to be frank. Not really. You know, it was more fans than parents, in effect. And then all of a sudden the academy system's going. So you go down to Carrington then, and now you've got all the parents of the under sixes, all the parents of the under sevens, all the parents of the under eights. You get the gist. So it's now full of parents, mothers and fathers, you know, with their kids in these shiny kits with all the bags and taking trips abroad, doing whatever they're doing. And now all of a sudden they're dreaming. And then in line with that, you've got the incredible salaries that footballers are being paid. So now all of a sudden you've got this family pressure with this dream that if my kid can make it, he's going to make a lot of money. So I think the pressure on parents, and then by default to the kids, because some of the things that parents say on the sidelines, you shake your heads and go, let the coaches get on with their job. You know what I mean? And you even see it in five-a-side football or anything. You know, they're screaming at the parents are a nightmare. They're screaming at the kids, screaming at the ref, screaming at everybody. So I think there's a lot more pressure on that. And I think the other thing that's changed in the last maybe 10 to 12, 15 years is social media. And I think before, the only pressure on players was reading the Sun or the Mirror or whatever the paper was, and looking at what their their score out of 10 was by, whoever it was. Frank McGee in the Mirror gave them a score out of 10. And that was the closest they got to feedback, apart from their manager and their colleagues. Now you've got Instagram feedback, Twitter feedback, web-based forum feedback, Reddit feedback. You get the gist. And they're getting it left, right, and center. And that feedback isn't always constructive, and that feedback isn't always considered. And that feedback is often very reactionary, as we saw against Garnacho. So I think that's harder for them, how they stay away from that. And I know the club does a lot of work in social media training, but kids will be kids. They're going to look at those things, because they're emotionally immature. They're 14, 15, 16 years old. They're immature. And we forget that. And Garnacho's 18. He's immature. So he's going to say and do immature things because he's an 18-year-old kid. And I think that's the difference, Benny. That's the huge pressure. I don't think it's the pressure of the game. In some ways, it was probably more pressure in the old days, because if you didn't make it, you ended up down the coal mine. If you didn't make it, you couldn't afford a summer holiday. There were players out there who needed the bonus to pay the rent. So I think there was probably a lot more pressure on people from a life perspective in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. And if you got a broken leg, there was no workers' comp. If you got a bad football injury, that's it. You're snookered. Now, doesn't make any difference. You go into coaching, you've got huge wages to back it up. You've got the PFA to support you. They're in a very supported environment. So that I think so is it harder? Yes, in some ways, but in many ways, no, it's not any harder.
I was just going to add as a follow-on, obviously, Benny, feel free if you've got anything to add off the back of that. But obviously, you mentioned, Garnacho, on Wednesday night. He was obviously, as you said, if you go back to anyone who's 18, you look at, your decisions and the actions that you take at that age, it's always going to be a little bit kind of all, because that's what you do when you're 18. And obviously, Garnacho was clearly searching his own Twitter name on Wednesday night to find up the tweets that he was liking there. Because you go, at 17, 18, especially being part of this generation, growing up, that's all you've known. Because you're just intrigued. You try and pretend that you're not interested, but of course he's going to look on. So what are people saying? And I agree with you, but I don't even think you played that bad anyway. If I'm being totally honest, missed a couple of opportunities, but name me a player that doesn't miss opportunities. We had, you could argue. Look at when we had Ronaldo. People say he was the best around. Look how many opportunities he missed when he was with us. So it happens. He's an 8 year, and I agree. I think certainly on the parent side, you raised a good point there. I'm not going to name them, but I knew. A family, their kid was in the Villa Academy, all the way from, I think, 10 years old, got up to, and had a couple of subs coming off the bench in the Carabao Cup and these kind of things. And the family were onto this, you've got to make it, you've got it, and all this. And I'm like, just let the kid enjoy football. Like, why does it matter if, he didn't get in the end and he's doing something else now? And I always feel like parents, just like you said, it's almost that added pressure now because there's so much money in it. If a player makes it even into the football pyramid, into League Two and above, it's still mega money compared to the average person. So, yeah, it's definitely a good point you raise on parent pressure, as well as, like you said, social media and all these other pressures that are around kids nowadays. I couldn't even imagine. I said to somebody the other day, I get nervous walking out doing like 5-a-side or something. I couldn't imagine being 18, walking out on the pitch in front of so many people at Old Trafford playing against Leeds. And like you said, to come on and at Ellen Road and do what he did after looking these kids are going to be so mentally strong nowadays. I just wanted to move on to a player, obviously another player that I don't know which one to pick, actually. Let's briefly talk about Hannibal, because we were talking about
good goal, wasn't it?
I was going to say the free kick that he scored the other night, that was fantastic. That's why, obviously, I chose to put him on the thumbnail, actually. So another player I think people, fans, have got very high hopes for. What have you kind of made of him? Obviously, we've got a lot of players out on loan. Hannibal, obviously, one of them over at Birmingham. We've had a few players go to Birmingham, obviously Chong and Mengi and the likes of as well. What have you made of him, and where do you kind of see his next kind of 18 months going? Because he's a player that I think, obviously, he's 20 years old now, so he's getting to the point where if he's going to make it into the first team, it's going to be in the next 18 months-ish, you'd expect. Do you kind of expect that to happen now, or do you think he's going to be one of these players that's good, goes out on loan, and we might see him kind of into his mid-20s?
The question with Hannibal was never his technical skill or his ability to play the game. And we've had this conversation about numerous players. The question mark over Hannibal was his temperament on the pitch. I mean, he got booked every game. And he got booked every game, not because he lashed out at a player, it was because he spoke bad back to the referee. Now, the reason he did that was because the other players knew if they tapped him, pulled his hair, pinched him, whatever tactics they used, he would react. And they just used it to, wind him up. And it was successful. Now, what I haven't heard, because I don't follow Birmingham, I don't know whether that part of his game is being managed. But the only way you can manage it, I mean, as part of my job, I'm a kind of a coach, facilitator kind of, role with a lot of businesses, and I teach resilience. And the only way to build resilience is to put yourself in uncomfortable positions. That's the only way to do it. In other words, put yourself in the firing line and then try to manage all of these things happening. You're not going to manage your temperament by not putting yourself in that position, if that makes sense. It's the only thing you can do. So what I haven't heard is about his temperament getting in the way. I'm hearing that he's well liked by his colleagues. I think you saw a really good example of that when he scored that goal, that everybody was behind him. You can always tell, can't you, when someone doesn't like someone on a pitch? They just clap and walk back to the halfway or whatever. They all ran over. They all like him, right? So he's clearly growing up in terms of mixing in with the crowd, with the players, and they're all mature than him. So that's the first thing. Secondly, he hasn't lost any of his smartness. The thing I liked most about that goal was it was smart. So he's got a brain. Now, I think that's the difference between thinking about when people are going to make it or not make it. Have you got the decision making at the top level? I think he has. So the question for me with Hannibal is, can he manage the temperament? Because the temperament, like we've just talked about with Garnacho, how's he going to bounce? What's his resilience like? And when it goes to Premier League, it's going to be even worse. Because, in the Premier League, you're up against Argentinians and you're up against all these players with the dark arts of the game, and they know how to wind people up. So if he's done that, I think he's good enough to be integrated into the first team. I think he's good enough. I think he's better than a couple of other midfielders with options we've got at the moment. I really do. If he can't manage his temperament, and Ten Hag will do it, and Benny, that could be another mentoring role if you want to think about it in that way, right? When he doesn't need teaching technical stuff, he's about resilience and emotional intelligence. So if they can coach and mentor that, I think we've got a good player on our hands. Now, is he going to be a world beater? I don't know. Could be. Because technically, I tell you what I do like. I like the way he runs at people. You know, and Diallo's come on. Look at the way Diallo's come on. I mean, he's not an academy graduate, but you know, he's a young kid coming into the team. You know, he's performing well. His temperament seems good. He's running at people. People don't like it when you run at them. You know, and that's the difference. But that's why I love people like Ravel Morrison, Jesse Lingard, one or two others. They ran at defenses, and defenses don't like it. It's very unique. You know, Charlie Savage doesn't do that. Iqbal doesn't do that. Mainu doesn't do that. They're a different type of player. But those other players, they do that, and it scares defenses. And that's why I think he could bring something to the first team. But he's got to deal with the temperament. That's just an opinion.
I was going to say just quickly, Benny, before you jump in, I know Troy Deeney spoke very highly of him as well. I was watching an interview, but I can't remember what podcast it was on, but I know Troy Deeney was speaking about it, and the fact that, you know, players that have come from United do have that great mentality, that work ethic side of the game that's drilled into them. And he said the United lads are actually better trainers almost than some of the, you know, senior pros that have been there for, you know, 5, 6, 7+ years. So yeah, I mean, Benny, for yourself, I don't know whether you wanted to move on to another player or whether you've got something else on Hannibal. I know you've watched him a hell of a lot over the years as well.
It's just on the aggression side, really. We think back to a young Wayne Rooney when he was coming through Everton's academy. He was quite an aggressive player, liked to get stuck in, you know, like to, you know, leave his mark, shall we say, on players, you know. And his temperament was always questioned throughout his career as a senior player, you know, whether he be sarcastically clapping people, lashing out at people. I just think that sometimes you don't want to be taking that temperament away from those type of players, because you miss that kind of fire then. And there don't seem to be that sort of, there don't seem to be the same type of player, because I could probably point to another one. Tony probably could correct me on this. Dan Gore as well. Coming through the academy now, he's got a bit of a spark about him, you know. At the end of the Stoke match, when unfortunately the 18s went out in the FA Youth Cup, it was there in players' faces, there in the opposition coaches' faces, you know, pushing and shoving them about. I like that. I like them type of players that, you know, that are not scared to get stuck in, not scared to fight for the badge, not scared to stick up for their teammates. So I'm just thinking sometimes if you try and temper that down a little bit, does that maybe stifle him as a player? Does that maybe stifle him as a person? I don't know, Tony. What do you think? Do you think that
I think there's a difference? I think what you're talking about is controlled aggression.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I think you're talking about, and I think Gore has controlled aggression.
Yeah.
And remember, he's 17 years old, so he's going to overstep the mark. I think Hannibal has uncontrolled aggression.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense, mate. Yeah.
So until he deals with the emotionality, he will react emotionally. Gore doesn't react emotionally. Gore reacts physically. You get the difference? So when you react physically, then fine, you push a few players around and you get what he doesn't do is he doesn't go around screaming at the referee in the referee's face. That's what Hannibal does. So Hannibal, when he emotionally responds, it creates an emotional reaction from the referee I'm talking about. So all of a sudden, the referee is now on top of him. And so he's his own worst enemy, not because of his controlled aggression and that bite, because what you're talking about is bites.
Yeah.
I've got no problem with Hannibal's bite. And Dan Gore's bite, I love that about his game. And it's very Rooney-esque. And I have no problem about, you know, someone's just mentioned, you know, angry Rooney. He was brilliant when he was fired up because he would fire up a lot of people around him. You know, maybe we need to see a bit more of that, you know, in some of the teams. You could argue that one or two of the first team players that we brought in, i.e. Martinez, has given us a little bit more fight for the first team. There's a little bit more anger there. There's a little bit more edge, bite, whatever word you want to use, Benny. I think that's the positive, but it's controlled. And when Garnacho leaves his foot in and Casemiro does the same, we all know they did it on purpose, right?
Yeah.
We all know they did it on purpose. But they don't then go screaming and yelling all over the place to the referee. You never see Martinez and Casemiro get emotional.
But do you think, though, as well, because Bruno Fernandes is quite an emotional player as well, he'd usually go waving his arms out and screaming at the referee. Yes, all right, he's had the captain's armband on as well. But do you think that Hannibal might look up and say, oh, Bruno's doing that for the first team?
I don't know. Maybe. But again, if you're going to compare Bruno Fernandes is also doing it on the pitch.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And Hannibal isn't. So Bruno Fernandes has got a certain degree of credibility already in the game, and Hannibal has to. He's not achieved anything yet.
Yeah, yeah. Fair point, mate. Fair point. Sorry, Connor.
No, it's a great dialogue because what we're learning from this is how many different things affect the development of a youth player, and what, you know, if I had a penny for every single person who ever said to me, "Who do you think is going to make it?" and the answers is always the same. It depends on three things, and those three things are all different for every single player. You know, you could argue four things. One's emotional maturity. Two is technical ability. Well, you wouldn't be United if you didn't have the technical ability. So basically, you're saying, do they have the emotional maturity? And three is the motivation. Now, if you've got those three things, you've got a bloody good chance of making it. But most players are motivated. I never go by these things that players are demotivated. They have moments, but most of the time they're going to be pretty motivated. And most of the time they've got the technical ability. So have they got the emotional resilience? Have they got that emotional intelligence? That's the missing link. And then after that, the only fourth thing I would add is don't underestimate a bit of luck.
Yeah, well, we're going to ask you that question in a short while.
Luck plays a big role. Look at Marcus Rashford. He was on the bench. Next thing you know, Martial's injured in the warm-up. He gets thrown in for his debut, scores 2 goals, does the same against Arsenal. Next thing you know, his career's on fire. Now, that's luck. Now, it's not luck how he performed on the day. That's training and practice and being ready and all those other positive things I mentioned. But he might not have got a run for another year if Martial hadn't got injured. Do you know what I'm saying? So you can't legislate for that. That's luck, being in the right place at the right time, or having a manager like Fergie for 26 years. You know, that's a bit of luck, because there's been a few players like Januzaj and one or two others that might have performed differently if they were in the middle of Ferguson's reign. So they were a little bit unlucky that, you know, Moyes came in and then, you know, Van de Gaal came in and, you know, and Mourinho came in, and there's 2 or 3 youth players who probably could have made it and didn't through no fault of their own because of all these back changes. So that's luck. That's you know, it's just fortune, and that's life. You know, it happens to everybody. So that fourth element, you have to factor in a little bit.
No, 100%. We're going to get to, obviously, the 21s and 82 to look out for and all those kinds of things in just a second. And that was a good conversation about, you know, you're talking about controlled aggression and things like that. We were literally obviously just having this debate on the women's channel, talking about obviously the other two red card of Mark Skinner's comments after the game, you know, when he said, I don't want to have that conversation with her because I don't want her to lose that bite in her. And it's exactly the same. You want players to have that. I was just arguing that same case, that I want the players to have that little bit of, you know, side to him. Obviously, that's a whole other conversation.
I think that's fair enough. And Ella's not had as far as I'm aware, she hasn't had a track record of that kind of behaviour. So it was a one-off. With Hannibal, it was every bloody game. And that's the difference.
No, 100%. The other player I just wanted to mention before we look at the 21s, 18s a little bit before we look to wrap this one up. Obviously, Kobe Mainoo is another one who's come into the squad. It seems like he seems to be, obviously, if there's another academy player that's going to be in the match day squad, it's going to be him, alongside obviously the ones that we know, obviously, that's been there for a few years now, Rashford, McTominay, and so on. Mm-hmm. What have you made of his right? Because again, he's another one that was mentioned on this show when we did this about a year, 18 months or so ago, when he was kind of playing in the younger ages. Again, another young player in himself. I think he's 17 still. I don't even think he's 18 yet. You know, come on, and things like that. What have you made of his rise and kind of his involvement in the team? So again, like I said, obviously Ten Hag must think a lot of him to be in the team already at where he is. Or do you think, like, obviously you mentioned luck there, how do you kind of feel, you know, do you feel like it is luck? Do you, obviously there's the talent there as well? What have you made of his kind of involvement so far moving into the first team?
Bear with me a second. He was in the 18s last season, and in the first half of this season, he stepped up to the 21s. So he's played in all competitions, something like 15 games, something like that. Mostly in the first half of the year, since before Christmas. And yeah, he's very mature. And I think, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think he's mature technically. I think he's mature emotionally, where he's still got to, and Iqbal's the same, by the way. I just don't think they're physically developed. So will they get there? I think so. because they've got the temperament, they've got all the other things there. And the thing with the young players is physicality will come naturally. I mean, people say, oh, they won't get physical. Scared players aren't physical, right? You know, we've all played five-a-side football. There's certain players just won't go into tackles, right? And there's other kids just fly into tackles. You know, they're just naturally got that kind of aggression. Well, you look at Mainu and you look at Iqbal, they're naturally aggressive players in terms of fighting for the ball, shielding the ball, tackling. I've got no problem with their physicality. The only problem with their personal physicality is they're very slight. So I think we just need to see them, grow up physically as men before we probably see the best of them. The other thing with Mainu is he hasn't played much. So since Christmas, we're now into the middle of February. He hasn't played much football in 6 weeks. And so there comes a point in time when at that age, 17, you need to be playing football pretty regularly. So my question would be, what's going to happen longer term? Are they going to put him back to the 21s? Is he going to learn anything there? Are they going to shoot him out on loan next summer? Or are they going to start giving him cameos for the first team? And the challenge you've got is the more successful you are for the first team, the less opportunities you're going to have because the rotation won't be there. So if we start fighting for an FA Cup, or we're in the League Cup final, I guarantee, and by the way, we've got injuries, which helps. But if Ericsson was fit and Van der Beek was fit and McTominay was fit, Iqbal and Mainu wouldn't be on the bench.
Yeah, that's a very good point there. But that leads us on nicely to the 21s, which have had a bit of a mixed bag this season. League form's not been great up until the last sort of 6 games where they've sort of picked up quite well. But then obviously, they also had a very, very good run in the Papa John's Trophy this year. Getting to the knockout stage for the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, first time since they started playing in this competition. What have you made of the 21s? And also, who's been the standout performer for the 21s? I know there's been a lot that's sort of gone out on loan and lots that have gone into the first team and lots that have sort of played above their age group. Is there anyone that particularly stands out for you?
Good question. The 21s has been a strange season. You've got a brand new manager in Mark Dempsey, not brand new to the club, but he was new and he got a lot of criticism early on because, of the results, which in my opinion was just, overreaction because we weren't losing games. We were drawing games. The team he had was predominantly last season's under-18 team. So it wasn't like he had any experience in that squad. So he's taking a bunch of under-18 players. I never forget, we might have even had this conversation, Benny, in the first game of the season. It was against Brighton or someone. And Charlie McNeil was up against 2 central defenders who were 6'4". One of them had 400 games, first team games behind him. And the other one had something like 250 or 300 games behind him. So Charlie McNeil is up against, and one of them was an international. He's up against 2 centre halves with 700 league games behind him. He didn't get a kick. Now, yeah, good experience for Charlie McNeil, but how's he going to score a goal? So when people say, oh, we're crap, we couldn't do anything, I sometimes think, are you reading the game here? He's never going to score a goal against those players. What he will do is he'll learn about making a run. He'll learn about using deception to beat a player, but he's certainly not going to do it with physicality. But he has to learn that. He has to try to be physical with them to see. And when he starts bouncing off them all the time, he then has to learn, I'm going to have to get clever to beat these players because I'm not going to do it with speed and I'm not going to do it with physicality because I'm a small guy. So I'm going to have to do it another way. I have to do it with my runs. I'm going to have to do it with, my decision making. I'm going to have to do it with my positioning. I'm going to have to do it with, feints and deceptions and all the great things that these coaches tell her. So I think with Charlie, as an example, I think he needs a different type of coaching. I think he needs the technical coaching, if that makes sense. Yeah. So all these players need different things. And I think what Mark Dempsey had in the first half of the season was he had a lot of under-18 players who didn't have the adult technicality. And they all came through into the team at once. And it just took time. And now all of a sudden they played 12, 15 games together for the most part. And now all of a sudden they've gelled and they know each other and it's working. So, you've got the likes of, Amari Forson, who's been in and out the team injured, but on his day has played really, really well. You know, he scored
Brilliant hat trick as well at the weekend.
yeah, and he played really well. I've also seen him have nightmares where he's been, you know, anonymous. So the challenge you've got with kids at that age, particularly if they're playing above their age, which these boys are, is they're going to be still inconsistent. Remember, they're 16, 17 years old. They're inconsistent by nature. So if they're inconsistent by nature, you're not going to get a collective performance. Now, all of a sudden, that they've been gelling. And the other thing that may have helped us, you know, is during the World Cup is, you know, Mark Dempsey had them all in Carrington, spending time with them for 6 weeks. So they could, and they played a few friendly games and stuff. So, you know, against Altrincham and someone else, I can't remember who else, Cardiff, I think. And so all of a sudden you've got, you know, an opportunity, and we've won 5 on the bounce, 6 on the bounce, and we are the form team in the league, and we've jumped from you know, bottom of the league and up to 6th place or something. You know, now all of a sudden things are looking rosy, and I'm thinking, well, it's still not rosy. There's still a lot of players there that probably won't make it. I think the players who will make it will be the players who are already on the cusp. So of the youth team that won the FA Youth Cup last season, Vitek has been on the bench. McNeil's had an opportunity. Mainu's had an opportunity. Garnacho's had an opportunity. Bennett's been on the bench. So there's a handful already, which is pretty good. Half the team, 5 out of 11, have kind of been involved. And there might be 1 or 2 others that will get a chance. The other thing to remember, Benny, is our injuries are atrocious. Absolutely. I mean, we've got a whole team of under 18s injured, a whole team. So you've got 15-year-old kids playing in the 18s, and you've got 16-year-old kids playing or 17-year-old kids playing with the under 21s. So, of course, you're not going to get the consistency, as I mentioned earlier. But what you'll do is you'll find out who's capable. That's what you'll find out. I think Gerardo's played really consistently in the under 21s as an example. Will he make it? I don't think so. It's just he hasn't got that next level maybe, but he's been very consistent. Bennett, I think, has been fine this year. I think Hardley's had a good season, but again, I don't think he's good enough to take the next level. I think he's on par with a Dishon Bernard or a Ted and Mengi, where he'll probably need to go out. He hasn't been on loan yet. I think he'll need a loan. I don't think he's of that ilk. You know, the player who I really rate is Tyler Fredrickson, who came into the under 21s and performed really well, but he's been injured for the last 4 months. You know, I mentioned we've got a lot of injuries. So, you know, there's players like that and others, you know, I just don't think they're going to do the step up. But let's go back to our first question. They're not all going to make it, but they will make a career in the game, and they will, you know, have an opportunity and all that great stuff. So, you know, good luck to the lads. But they know that. They know they're not all going to make it.
Just lastly, before I hand over to Connor, just want to go back to the Papa John's, because I'm pretty sure he was at Bolton, wasn't you? You know, you got a good 1,000 or 2,000 away fans in the away end at the University of Bolton Stadium cheering on those kids. What a great experience that would have been. Yes, ultimately went out of the competition on that night, but it's still what a great, fantastic advert for youth football, and is it so great that we're the club that always pioneers the youth side of the game, and we always turn up at our numbers, as we did for the FA Youth Cup final at Old Trafford. But we're showing it's not just a one-off. We'll get a couple of thousand fans down on a freezing cold night, because it was bitterly freezing cold that night at the University of Bolton Stadium. That could only stand their players in good stead as well going forward.
I think so. I think that's why you've heard about the link up we've got with Altrincham.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we're doing that, and that's another one of those pioneering things. So Maxi Oideli, who a lot of people think a lot of, he's training at Carrington during the week, and then he's playing for Altrincham on a Saturday afternoon. Yeah. And there's a couple of other players who are going to do the same thing. They're going to send a couple more that way. We've just sent Tom Worcester out to Ramsbottom for that, because we've got so many blinking goalkeepers. So, you know, he's going to get some non-league experience. And there's always been this discussion about, is the reserve league competitive enough? And I think you're right, Benny. I don't think it is. I think the step up between that league and the first team is getting wider, not getting closer. So things like the EFL Cup, things like the Premier League International Cup, things like putting these players out to non-league football on loan. To just, Will Fish was even a great example. Will, and I'm summarising here, so please don't quote me, but Will, we were talking about emotionally mature. Will was brought into the first team. He made a first team appearance, and they felt he was really immature. He didn't know how to handle himself in a first team dressing room. Now, there's some basics there, right? Some basics about how you interact around adults. But if that's not in your temperament, how do you fix that? So what they did is they sent him to Stockport for half a season, knowing that he was never going to play. And there's lots of people saying, what a shit move and what a waste of time. That's not why he was sent there. He was sent there to get experience playing with a squad and experiencing what it was like to be in a successful first team dressing room. That's what they sent him for. Now he's gone up to Hibs. He's taken him a little while to settle in. He scored a goal. He's now, they're singing his name, and all of a sudden things are clicking in for him. So he's good. Some players are really late developers. And I think it's really easy to build on your point. It's really easy to say things like, Forson scored a hat-trick for the under-21s. He's ready for the first team. Or Hugel scored a few goals recently. Let's throw him into the first team. Most of us haven't got a clue, right? We don't understand that what level they're at. I've just noticed Jarvis has talked about stagnation. I kind of agree with that. I kind of think it's not a stagnation thing. It's a plateau and then a push, a plateau then a push. And I think what Will Fish has done is gone plateau, push, plateau, push, plateau, push. So we're now seeing, is he good enough for United? Who knows? Probably not, but who knows? And I think that's all we need to do is every time we recognize a plateau, have a push somewhere. And that push is not always technical pushes. The push is a physical push, an emotional push. So with someone like Mason, we'll talk about Mason just for a second. His push a few years ago was gym work because he had plateaued in terms of his physicality. So they thought, right, you're now part of the first team. You're going to get regular first team football. We need to build you up a little bit. And so he was on a gym schedule, right? So that's the plateau and the push, the plateau and the push. With Jarvis is right. We've got to make sure that we look after the real big talents. And sometimes when you're looking after the big talents, the smaller talents can kind of get lost. But the under-23 football will help that. Sorry, the EFL Cup and things like that, Benny, will help. The other thing it does is, why do you think Shola Shoretire is now at Bolton? Do you think that's a coincidence? No, it's because the Bolton manager and the Bolton coaching staff were watching Shoretire play against them. You know what I'm saying? Last December, and they went, shit, he could do a job for us. So now all of a sudden, these players are showcasing themselves at Rotherham and Lincoln and Scunthorpe and Grimsby and wherever we're going, Fleetwood and Morecambe, and those teams are going, maybe we'll get him out here for 3 months, give him a chance. I think that's great. So I think there's that other side of it where they get to showcase in front of other scouts who wouldn't normally see that. Because it's all right saying, how do you play against another 17-year-old player? Or how do you play against another 19-year-old player? But what we're seeing Shoretire play against 25 and 28-year-old players. That's what the scouts are looking for now, if that makes sense.
No, I 100% agree with that. And I think, there was a couple of comments, but earlier it was Jarvis actually talking about, long-term loan deals and all these kinds of things. Just very quickly on a player that I forgot to mention earlier on, before we look to wrap this one up on a final question. Just a player that I thought of that we did speak about on the last show, and a player that's kind of been forgotten about, really, albeit we've actually had some issues in that position. Ethan Laird. Somebody, again, I think a lot of fans forget is still one of ours. Obviously, he came through the academy. I think this is his fourth loan now at QPR. I think this is his fourth.
He's been at Bournemouth. He's been at QPR. He was somewhere before Bournemouth.
Swansea and MK.
Swansea. Yeah, I think he's had 3 loans, yeah.
Yeah, so where do you think because like I said, we've had loads of issues at right back. Obviously, Wan-Bissaka came back and did pretty well, to be fair to him. He's come back in and done well. Obviously, Dallow's there now. But I would have thought with all the upheaval of that right back slot that Laird could have come back and potentially come back. Do you just think maybe he's not impressing enough on loan? Do you think the club have got a longer term plan for him to looking in the future and maybe getting him into the squad in the next kind of 2? Because again, he's another player. I always kind of look at players coming through the academy when they hit 21, 22, 20. 23 is the limit for me. If they start getting to that point, they're still not in the first team. I don't think they're going to make it in. So Laird's another one. He's 22 this year. Do you think this is kind of his year? If he's going to get into the first team, it's got to be this year, or can you see him having a good career, in the Championship, League One, League Two, or wherever it is he decides to go if he is to leave United?
The problem with Ethan, by the way, ever since I first saw him at 13, 14, 15 years old, very impressed with him. And he carried all that through to under 18s. The problem with Ethan is he's injury prone. He's forever picking up knocks in and out of the team. And managers, I remember Ferguson saying, I'm going to buy Steve Bruce. And they said, well, he's a Championship player. He was a second division player. Why are you buying him? And his answer was he never gets injured. So there's this, managers don't want glass players. Think about who we've got in the first team right now, right? We've got a couple of glass players. And if they're forever injured, the manager cannot afford to have them in the squad because they can't contribute. So I think, unfortunately for Ethan, he has been injured. Even while he's been on loan at Swansea, he was in and out of the team. Bournemouth, he was in and out of the team. So I think those injuries have affected a little bit of his development through no fault of his own. What we're seeing now at QPR is some consistency. The challenge you've got, of course, is when Ten Hag is looking after the first team at Old Trafford, then the likes of our, Fernandez at Preston, or Laird at QPR, or Mejbri at Birmingham, or even the new boys going out on loan recently. It's very hard to keep up in touch with them. Certainly the manager's not. I would be really surprised with everything going on if Ten Hag is keeping an eye on Ethan Laird. But obviously the managers are, the coaching staff are, and they're getting feedback and all the rest of it. But it goes back to that plateau thing, Connor. We've not seen Ethan Laird at United for a couple of seasons now because of all his loans and injuries. And so we're not really sure about the plateau push that I talk about. I think Brandon Williams is another one. We've just not seen enough of him. Teden Mengi's another one. Axel Tuanzebe's another one. We haven't seen these people play for 12 months. So we don't really know how they've pushed on or how they've plateaued in that period. Clearly Brandon Williams is not getting games under Ten Hag, so Ten Hag's probably already made his decision about Brandon Williams, I'm guessing. Because all he keeps doing is putting Shaw in the middle and bringing on Malacia and Wan-Bissaka and then swapping them around. Brandon's been on the bench a couple of times, but he's not using him. Absolutely, Jarvis. And I think the question you then ask yourself, to Connor's point, is that their level? Now, with Fernandez, it's his first season out on loan. He's a lot younger than Ethan. We probably need to get him back and reassess that. With Ethan, I really don't know, but I kind of agree with you, Connor. There's not many players who get to a certain age and then all of a sudden that push plateau thing I was talking about is such a big push that all of a sudden they're back in. It has to be for a reason. The best example I can give you is Jesse Lingard. So when Jesse Lingard was first, his quality at 15, 16, 18 was unquestionable. At under 21, unquestionable. His quality all there. He just wasn't mature enough. So it took 2 years for him to go out. He came back. Tom Cleverley a little bit the same, right? TC, he was a little bit the same. He played first and went out, but TC was roughly the same. He just lacked a bit of maturity in different ways. So both of those players came back and they only really made themselves first team players when they were 24, 23, 24. So unless it's a very unique situation, like Tom Cleverley, but particularly Jesse Lingard, because of the way he was physically developing and emotionally developing, then I think you're right. I think probably for Ethan, he's probably going to be sold in the summer, if not the year after, and I think he will have a good career in the game. I think he's good enough for a championship team. He's got all the right attributes. As we said right at the beginning of the program, a lot of managers want Man United players.
You mentioned, just quickly before you jump in, Benny, there's so many players you mentioned. I completely forgot that we still had on our books. You're talking about obviously Williams there at Mengi, Tuanzebe. Obviously Fernandez was another one. I loved him last season. In the academy watching him. There's so many players that again you talk about that fans build up. this expectation. And Benny's question is going to wrap the show up really kind of on this point that we speak about a lot of players, but a player that makes it into United's squad has clearly got both the elements that you mentioned earlier, because otherwise we speak about so many players to watch and all these kinds of things, but only 2, 3 at most, which is still massively impressive. It's credit to the academy and where it's at, actually make it through. So yeah, Benny, I'll let you fire away with the final one to kind of wrap this all full circle.
Well, I just wanted to give a mention to the under-18s. Obviously, they are third in the league. Three games hand over the table toppers Manchester City, and obviously, disappointingly, we went out the FA Youth Cup this year. Couldn't defend it. We went out to a 1-0 loss at Stoke. I was wondering what you've obviously made of the 18s, and I know there's been, as you said, plenty of injuries. I mean, Dan Gore, as I mentioned before, he's really impressed me as well when he's played for the 18s or the 21s. I just wanted to know, is there maybe a younger player that's having to play above their age group that's impressed you for the 18s as well? And obviously what have you made of the under 18 season so far as a whole?
The 18s is an interesting group. We've got, I think, 12 injured players in the under 18s at the moment. To name half a dozen: Finlay McAllister, Ethan Ennis, Ogunai, Fredrickson, Ruben Curley. There's a handful just off the top of my head, and they would all be in that team first choice, and they're not available for a whole bunch of reasons: cruciate ligament injuries, knee injuries, etc., etc. So what you've got is a team made up of some new under 18s like Ethan Williams and Jace Fitzgerald and James Nolan and Jack Kingdon and all the rest of it. So you've got a handful of 17-year-old kids, which is why I think we went out in the FA Youth Cup, because the squad we had was a very young squad. And we played badly on the night, right? So let's not take anything. We had a bad day at the office as well. And if you look at our bench was totally inexperienced. And now all of a sudden we've got Reece Munro, made his debut just a few days ago. Scanlon, Lacey, Kaba, Oriola. I'm naming names here a lot of people won't have heard of. And they're all making their debuts. And they're 15 years old, 14 years old. And they're making their debuts because we haven't got the depth. Well, we got the depth in the group, but we haven't got our regular first team players in that positions. So the fact that they're third in the league with 3 games in hand, and if they win those 3 games, they would be equal first, is really phenomenal. And it says a lot for the players coming in, but it also says a lot for Travis Binion and the coaching team. They won the FA Youth Cup last season. He's third in the league. This team, we're probably the youngest squad in the team. We've won in our last 5 games. We've had 3 wins and 2 draws, which is understandable given the very, very young nature of the team. So I think they're doing great. But again, going back to what we've been talking about most of this program, they're still very young, And I don't know if you've seen any academy games on telly. You look at a kid like even Jace Fitzgerald, who's good, solid player. But he's stepped up a year. He's not an under 18. He's an under 16. But he's playing under 18. He's in midfield against lads who are 2 feet taller than him, and 3 years older than him. Now, that's great experience, but you can't do that every week before you get tired or you get a knock or, whatever the case may be. So I think they've done brilliantly. I really do. And it shows that we've got some very, very good kids at that level. So I'm not suggesting that because they can jump from 15s and 16s to 18s, we've got stars in the making. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that technically they're good enough to move between those 2 divisions and contribute, which is what I'm thinking. And the second part of that, Benny, is that that's only going to help their development, not hinder their development. So that's a good thing because they're doing it collectively. In terms of specifics, what I've learned is that a lot of the hype with young players at 16 rarely manifests itself for the first team. So the kid who's going to make it out of this group will probably be someone you least expect. So I'm looking at that team and I'm saying, who's really performing? Again, we've got 10 players out injured. So if you looked at those 10 players, I've got 2 or 3 lads that I really like. Finlay McAllister, Jack Morehouse, Ethan. There's lads there that I like, but they've not played all season. So if you look at the lads that have been playing the last few weeks, there's been a lot of media talk about Shea Lacey, smallest kid on in the team, amazing balance, Giggs-like balance, fantastic left foot, scores goals all over the place, but he's immature. His defensive game is non-existent. He doesn't track back, and until he learns those things, he's never going to get anywhere near the first team. So even though he's incredibly skillful, he's still got a lot to learn. So he would be one that obviously is one to watch, Shea Lacey, and I'd recommend you do that. Another lad to watch who I like, but he's very under the radar, is James Scanlon. So Scanlon was one of these players we got from Derby County's academy about 3 years ago. I don't know if anybody remembers. We got Sekou Kaba, Nemea Oriola, and James Scanlon, and all the hype was around Kaba, but Scanlon, I think, is the one that they're secretly looking at, going, we think he could be a player. Sam Mather's the other one as well, but he's been out injured.
Good player, Sam Mather.
Yeah, I think he's a really good player. But talk about push plateau. He's been injured. How's that going to affect his development? I've got no idea. But so there's a couple of names to look out for. Will they make it? I have no idea. Fingers crossed. It's always nice to watch the kids come through and not make predictions, but just follow their careers and see what happens. But I think James Scanlon is a very smart player, very, very smart. But he's young and he's not big and all those other things we've spoken about. And Shea Lacey is clearly a talent. I've just noticed that someone's put in the chat box Ronaldo Brown. I don't know who Ronaldo Brown is. He's certainly. I'm assuming that's a statement from somebody. Is that a player?
I think Ronaldo. If I'm not mistaken, I think that's another. I think that's another YouTube channel. I think that's another.
Yeah, he is Stretford Paddock player or something.
Paddock, I think.
Didn't he? I think he had some sort of a youth. He was a youth prospect at a different team. Professional at one point, but I don't know.
I didn't know if the person made that comment knows some player under 13 or 14 level that's not in my line of sight and was saying this kid's a good player or something.
But yeah, I think his point saying the best ability is availability. It goes back from what you were saying earlier, Tony, about the injuries that some players have. They're not reliable, so they're not an asset to the team, because if they keep getting injured, it's the guy from Stretford Paddock. But yeah, I think the point around that was what you were talking about earlier with the injuries and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that we've not talked about is versatility. So a player will also get a chance because they're versatile, and that can hurt you, but it can also hinder you. So the likes of Darren Fletcher, he was very versatile. The likes of Tom Cleverley was versatile. So he got a lot more games than he might have done because Kieran Richardson was very versatile. And if you go back in history, we've had a lot of players who are able to play in a lot of different positions. And I think if you've got that versatility, like Rashford has and Garnacho has, that gives the manager options. So they can play these players through the middle. They can play them on the wide left, wide right. And I think Alanga, I think, is probably in that. He's available all the time. He's rarely injured, and he's versatile. So you put that comment about the best ability is availability together with versatility, and then you're increasing your chances.
No, 100%. It was scary listening to you reeling off players, and I'm like, I'm just listening to their ages. I'm like, oh, my life. I think I'm getting old now. Some of these ages coming through playing for Man United, it's like, oh, my life.
Do you know what? I've just seen Jarvis talk about Hansen Aaron. Yeah. I don't know what to make of this kid. Right? I do not know what. One day I'll think this kid is a star in the making, and another day I'll see and I'll go, I don't get it. Now, what I do know is the coaches know a million things more than me. That's what I do know, and they may well have a longer term development plan for him, and he's still very small. Technically, no problem, and temperamentally, no problem. Physically, he's just tiny. So we'll wait and see. But clearly, the coaches see something, and on his day, that's very clear. He's just very inconsistent, in my opinion. So Jarvis, I don't know. I can see it, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I've not seen too much of him. I've got to be honest. I've seen him on a handful of appearances, so I wouldn't be able to add anything else to that.
And Colbert's just said anyone.
Yeah.
Like I have no idea who the Real Madrid guy is. I've probably not seen him play, so I can't comment. But going back to United, I don't see any. Oh my God! Outstanding, talented. This kid's going to be the next, whoever. I don't see. I've not seen anybody in the 16s or the 18s that is doing what Mason Greenwood did, or is doing what other players before him did. I've not seen any kids like that.
The interesting thing, isn't it? Just very quickly, my point on that is obviously Rashford's what most would argue is one of our best players right now. At youth level, there was a lot of people. If you watch the academy back when Rashford was in it, a lot of people were like, "Oh, he's going to make it." Rashford wasn't really in that. He was, again, as you said, good technical player, but he wasn't in that conversation. Yet he's the one that's made it to the top, and look at him now. So,
no, I think, when Greenwood was coming through, I don't think anybody on the sidelines had any doubt that he was the player he was going to be, right? So that was a given. And and I've seen YouTube compilations that make Marcus Rashford look like, Messi and Ronaldo. And I like Marcus. I think he's a cracking player, and he's proving his worth, and he deserves to be in the first. All of that. He's a great player. Okay, is he world class? Maybe not 100%, but he's clearly an elite player. Okay, that's all I'll say about him. He's an elite player. You have to be. He's just. We've got 2/3 of the season. He's got 21 goals, right? So he's an elite player. When he was coming through at 15, 16, and 17, he was very inconsistent. He would go games where he wouldn't do much. He would be out of the game. He was very slight in a way that Langer would be. So it was a surprise to me that he took his chance so well, and he adapted, and he was successful as he was. The thing with Marcus is he's very, very cool under pressure. If you remember that penalty against PSG, his temperament's fantastic, and he's got a very strong family unit that supports him. I'm pretty sure. But you're right, Connor. Anybody who says that he was the next big thing in the academy at the time, that's bollocks. No one was talking about Marcus Rashford at the time. Callum Gribben was the one everybody was talking about.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. That was the name I remember everyone was talking about at the
time.
He
didn't have the temperament, and now he's playing for Radcliffe, right? So and he probably had more technical gifts than Marcus did. But Marcus has got application, motivation, emotional intelligence.
Hard work as well, would you say, Tony? Hard work sometimes sometimes maybe more than talent. Those that are hard working sometimes be the ones that are more talented.
Jimmy Murphy always said, "It's never one or the other; it's both." And to be at Man United, you've got to have the talent. So, given you've already got the talent, the rest is motivation.
Yeah,
which is hard work. And as I say, I don't. I would question one or two players. Not dedication, that's way too strong. But you just think to yourself, are you really putting it in? Well, I think he is. I think Marcus Rashford is certainly putting it in because the results speak for themselves. He's a good player. He's a really good player. And people say, well, who in recent times has the academy produced? Well, you've just got a player there who's nearly on 350 games and 120 goals or whatever it is. So, well, he's not quite good enough. Well, define success. If that's not successful, define success for me. Are you talking about World Cup class? Well, he played in the World Cup and he scored some great goals in the World Cup. So how do you define success? He's not Messi? Well, then shit, 99% of players who play football aren't Messi. So define success. It's a dumb statement. He's not world class. McTominay, 200 games. I don't care whether you like him or not. He's played 200 frigging games.
I should say most would bite your hand off with just one.
He's a successful international footballer. He's played 200 games for one of the top teams in the world. Anyone who says he's shit hasn't got a freaking clue. Sorry.
And the fact is, how many managers have championed Scott McTominay? Even the great Jose Mourinho loves Scott McTominay. He made up his own little award for at the awards.
It doesn't make sense. And all it is what people are really saying is, he's not my favourite player, and he's keeping my favourite player out of it. Benny, I see enough on social media to know that there's a big, and I'm not going to get political, right? But I get a little bit irritated at certain people on social media who are criticising Mark Skinner for not playing the players he's not playing when the players he is playing have taken him to the top of the league. You know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's political because my favourite player isn't playing. That's all it is. It doesn't make sense.
Oh, trust me, we've had that debate countless times on the Whippets channel about that. Don't you worry about that. But just very quickly on Rashford, this is a player that, you know, some are talking about now. You know, whether you think he's world class or not, some people are putting him in potentially getting to Wayne Rooney's, you know, the top scorer record for Man United. If we have a player again coming through, obviously you're talking about other players that have come through the academy. If Rashford can get to that number, I don't know whether he will or not. You know, he's still 100+ goals away from Rooney's tally, I think. Even if he gets anywhere near that, you know, what a career he's had coming through, like I said, coming through the academy. And this is why I think when you ask that question, we always ask you this question anyway, who to watch out for and things like that. There's always a name that will make it that we've not said, or that maybe doesn't get the highest praise, because you, as you said, you just don't know. There's so many factors. Like you said, you need a bit of luck. It's got to be in your position. You know, you're relying on maybe someone getting injured or lack of form in your position, because it's all very well if you're a striker and a load of centre-backs get injured. Well, that's not great for you because you can't go back there and play there, can you? So, you know, you've got to have that little bit of luck as well and take the chance when it's provided to you.
I mean, with Marcus, and I don't know this for sure, but this is just based on what I do know. They'll be saying to him, look, Marcus, forget being the club's top record scorer, right? You're 80 goals away from anywhere near that. So if you're 80 goals away, that's another 4 seasons at 20 goals a season. So let's not think about what's going to happen in 4 seasons' time. Let's just focus on this season and see how many goals you can score this season. And I bet Ten Hag is saying, you've got 21, can you get 25? You've got 25, can you get 30? You've got 30, can you get 30? And it's possible, right? This is all possible. And then next season, let's see if you can beat last season, right? Let's just do 2 seasons. If he does that, he's up to 150 and 160. Now, all of a sudden, it's a different ball game. Do you know what I mean? It's how do you set those? And that's what, again, I keep talking about, push and plateau. So Ten Hag has got this really, and you saw him at the end of the game. I don't know if anybody saw it, straight up to Rashford, coaching him on the sideline. Did you see when he was talking to him? And you're thinking, what's he saying to him? Because he's not coaching technical capability, is he? He's talking about his mindset and his attitude, and he's doing something up here. It's really great leadership from Ten Hag. Great leadership. And I'm thinking to myself, he's going to turn into a really, really exceptional footballer if he keeps going. Is he world class? I don't care.
It's like you said, though, what is the definition of world class as well, though? You know, you speak to somebody, world class is how many Ballon d'Ors you won. You speak to somebody else, how many goals you scored. Speak to somebody else, how many trophies and medals they have. You know, the definition of world class from one person to the other person always differs. But the one thing we can say is that Marcus Rashford is an exceptional footballer. He always has been.
No argument. Absolutely no argument. And anybody who wants to have an argument with me on that, I'll just say the statistics just don't back up the subjectivity of what you're saying. It's not, that argument is non-logical. You might not like him. He might have had a bad season last season. I don't care. You know, the numbers, the statistics prove it. Can I just say one more thing just before we go? I just want to give a huge shout out to Tommy Heaton. I am so delighted for him. He was an academy graduate from 2003, 2004. A really, really nice kid, incredibly solid professional, one of the great pros in the game who've come through our system. He came back, obviously, as, you know, at the end of his career. We know he's ended his career. I'm just delighted that he's managed to make a couple of first-team appearances, and he's not let us down. And his professionalism, I think, also a huge factor for a lot of these kids coming through when they can see the likes of a Tom Heaton at the club doing what he does every single day. And I know we always talk about who's the next big thing, but I just thought I'd give a shout out to Tom because I think his role is incredibly underrated.
No, 100% agree with that. I hope he plays in the final. I really hope he starts. I don't think he will because I think Ten Hag wants obviously the trophy, but I don't think there's any harm in putting Heaton in goal for that one. You know, he played the second leg against Forest, didn't he? And then obviously the game with Charlton as well. So yeah, hopefully I've got my fingers crossed that we might see him start in that one. Because, you know, as you said, what a turnaround that really, obviously, as you said before, you know, for him to come back and then to win a trophy with United, that would just be, I know we'd get the Men trophy anyway.
I know we want to go, but we talked earlier, the first thing we said was, how do you define success? Tommy Heaton, that's how you define success.
Yeah.
He's an England international. He's played 400-500 league games for a range of different clubs. He's had a wonderful career. It started and ended at Manchester United. He's played for our first team. He will retire a very proud man. And I know his dad, Dave, he'll be a very proud man as well. You know, it's a great family, and you know, I'm so really happy for him.
Top goalkeeper as well. Got to remember the game he had at Old Trafford a few years back, and he was stopping everything that day. You know, it was like he turned into Superman that day. But what a great goalkeeper Tom Heaton's been over the last decade and a half. You know, great, fantastic club career for England international as well. Speaks volumes. You know, and an old ground decent. Like every time you hear him talk about the football club, he's always talking in positive light. You know, always talking about players positively as well.
Well, that's
absolutely fantastic.
And you know what? He is just as an important part of our academy as Ryan Giggs with his 950 games, or Marcus Rashford with his 100 goals, or you know, or any of the others. You know, the superstars with Ballon d'Or winners of Charlton and Georgie Best. He is just as an integral part of what being an academy player for United is as any of the others. And so I think that's a great way to end in terms of coming full circle.
Yeah.
Talk about someone like him because he's been a successful academy graduate.
No, 100%. You're bang on there. It is the perfect way to end. So we're back where we started, which is a great place. We've covered a hell of a lot in the last 90 minutes or so. Tony, thank you very much for coming on.
It's great to catch up. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the people in the chat box for coming in and adding some nice comments as well.
Yeah, you always add great insight when you're on. So we'll definitely organise one of these maybe towards the end of the season or over the summer or something like that. Benny, thanks obviously for yourself for coming back on as well. It's great to see you back on the channel. I know that we're going to see more of you across both channels in the next, well, hopefully next few weeks, next months, and whenever it is. This channel will be back live. Oh God, I don't know. Tomorrow, Wednesday, I'm not entirely sure. It's whenever I can fit it in, but obviously talking about Barcelona now, obviously looking ahead to the Europa League. Make sure you check out the women's channel as well. Obviously, that controversial red card, we were talking about that earlier. So make sure you go and check that out for all of that. Make sure you're liking and subscribing, and we shall see you in the next one.